There is a moment that never announces itself. No warning, no music, no dramatic pause, just silence. It happens when you finally stop refreshing your phone, when you realize the message you were waiting for isn't coming, the call, the encouragement, the approval, nothing. That moment isn't loneliness, it's exposure, because for the first time, the illusion collapses. You see the truth clearly and it terrifies you. No one is building this for you, no one is coming to rescue you, and no one actually needs you to win. Most men panic here. They call it bad luck. They call it betrayal. They call it unfair. But the truth is far more dangerous. This moment is not a curse. It's a test, and almost everyone fails it, because the average man believes success requires witnesses, applause, support, permission. He thinks momentum comes from people clapping behind him. He thinks motivation is borrowed energy. He thinks progress needs encouragement. Machiavelli saw through this lie centuries ago. He understood something most men still refuse to accept. Support does not create strength. Pressure does. And nothing applies pressure like being alone. Let me tell you a story. There was a man, no titles, no followers, no safety net, just an idea that refused to let him sleep. Every night it returned, heavier than the last. Every morning it asked the same question. What are you going to do without permission? He tried explaining it to others. They smiled politely. They changed the subject. They warned him to be realistic. That's when it happened. One night, after another conversation that went nowhere, he sat in his room and felt something crack. Not in pain, but in clarity. He realized something most people never do. The people around him weren't obstacles, they were anchors. They weren't stopping him intentionally. They were stopping him unconsciously, because when you succeed alone, you threaten every man who needs validation to move. And that's when the real shift begins. Not motivation, not confidence, detachment. He stopped explaining, stopped asking, stopped seeking consensus. And something strange happened. His mind sharpened. Without external noise, every decision became cleaner. Without approval, every move became deliberate. Without reassurance, every action had consequence. Alone, he had no one to impress, so he impressed reality instead. This is the secret most motivational content will never tell you. Support weakens urgency. When someone has your back, you subconsciously slow down. You assume there's time, a buffer, a second chance. But when there is no one, every move matters. Machiavelli warned leaders about this exact dynamic. A prince who relies on others' loyalty is vulnerable. A man who depends on support is predictable, and predictability is death. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you had full support right now, you would move slower, you would compromise more, you would dilute your vision to keep people comfortable. Isolation doesn't kill ambition, it purifies it. Because when you are alone, you are forced to answer one brutal question. Do I want this badly enough to continue without applause? Most men don't. They mistake loneliness for rejection, silence for failure, isolation for weakness. But the men who build empires see something else. They see freedom. Freedom from expectations. Freedom from consensus. Freedom from being understood. Machiavelli believed power begins when you stop needing to be liked, but it matures when you stop needing to be seen. The man in the story didn't become louder, he became quieter. He stopped announcing progress, stopped sharing plans, stopped defending decisions, and with every silent step forward, his confidence stopped being emotional and started becoming structural, because confidence built alone doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't collapse under criticism. It becomes dangerous. And here's where it gets unsettling. When you succeed alone, people don't just notice your results. They sense your independence. They feel it. And independence is threatening. Because it proves something they've spent their lives avoiding, that no one was ever stopping them either. In the next part, I'm going to show you the first rule of succeeding with zero support, the rule that instantly separates builders from beggars. But be warned, once you understand it, you can't go back to needing permission. There is a rule that decides everything, a rule so uncomfortable most men instinctively reject it the moment they feel it forming in their mind. Here it is. No one owes you belief. Not your family, not your friends, not your partner, not even the people who benefit from your success later. The man who understands this early saves himself years of bitterness. The man who resists it becomes fragile, because fragility is born from expectation. Most men don't fail because they lack talent. They fail because they secretly expect emotional payment. They expect encouragement for effort, praise for intention, support for struggle. And when it doesn't arrive, something corrosive begins to form. Resentment. Machiavelli warned about this exact weakness. A leader who feels owed loyalty becomes angry when it isn't given. A man who feels owed belief becomes reckless when it's denied. And recklessness destroys empires before they ever rise. Let me tell you what zero support actually means. It doesn't mean people hate you. It doesn't mean they want you to fail. It means they are neutral, and neutrality is the natural state of the world. The universe does not care about your potential. Reality does not reward effort. History does not record intentions. Only outcomes. The man who succeeds alone internalizes this early. He doesn't waste energy being offended. He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't argue for understanding. He adapts. There is a psychological shift that happens when you truly accept zero support. Your internal dialogue changes. You stop asking, "Why don't they believe in me?" and start asking, "What would belief even change?" That question is dangerous, because the honest answer is nothing. Belief does not build skill. Encouragement does not produce discipline. Support does not generate endurance. Pressure does. When there is no one cheering, you are forced to develop a different fuel source. Not motivation, not excitement, but obligation, an internal contract. I will do this whether anyone notices or not. That contract changes how you move. You stop posting progress, you stop announcing goals, you stop leaking energy to spectators. Your work becomes private, quiet, uninterruptible. Machiavelli understood secrecy was power. A visible plan invites interference. A silent strategy invites results. Most men talk themselves into exhaustion. They explain their dreams until they feel accomplished without doing anything. The man with zero support has no audience, so the only way he feels progress is by actually making it. This is why isolation accelerates growth. Every action must produce evidence. Every day must move something forward. Every weakness is exposed immediately. There is no emotional cushioning, and that hurts at first, because the absence of support feels like judgment. But it's not. It's purification. When no one believes in you, the only belief that matters is your own. And belief without witnesses becomes conviction. Conviction is heavier than confidence. It doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't care how you feel. It executes regardless. Here's the paradox. The men who complain about having no support are still dependent. They are dependent on recognition. The men who accept having no support become independent. And independence is magnetic, not because people admire it, but because they can't control it. Machiavelli wrote that power belongs to the man who can act without permission. But he also knew something darker. The man who acts alone becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is dominance. When people know your next move, they can interfere. When they don't, they can only react. The man in our story reached this stage quietly, No announcement, no declaration, just a subtle shift. He stopped reacting emotionally to silence, stopped interpreting neutrality as rejection, and something remarkable happened. He became faster. Decisions that once took days took minutes. Doubts that once lingered evaporated. Excuses died quickly, because excuses require witnesses. Alone, there was no one to convince, only work to be done. And this is where most men break, because zero support demands a brutal level of self-honesty. No one is coming to correct you. No one is coming to save you from your own mistakes. No one is coming to validate your suffering. You either produce or you disappear. But for the few who endure this phase, something irreversible happens. They stop needing permission, not just from people, but from their own fear. In the next part, I'm going to show you the second rule of succeeding with zero support, the rule that transforms isolation into leverage. And once you understand it, being alone will no longer feel empty. It will feel strategic. There is a moment when isolation stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like control. It's subtle, almost easy to miss, but once it happens, you never see people the same way again. Here's the second rule of succeeding with zero support. Isolation is not absence, it is positioning. Most men think being alone means being behind. They imagine success as a crowd pushing forward together. They picture teams, alliances, encouragement, momentum from numbers. That image is comforting and completely wrong. History doesn't move in groups. It moves when one man acts while everyone else is still discussing. Machiavelli understood this better than most. He knew that crowds slow decision-making. They dilute responsibility. They turn clarity into compromise. Isolation removes all of that. When you are alone, every outcome belongs to you. No shared credit, no shared blame. And that responsibility sharpens the mind. The man in our story noticed this shift one evening. He realized something unsettling. The silence around him wasn't resistance. It was space. Space to think without interruption. Space to move without permission. Space to make mistakes without embarrassment. Most men fear this space, because in silence there is no one to distract you from your own standards. You can't blame the group. You can't hide behind consensus. You can't soften failure by saying, "We tried." It's just you, and that's exactly why isolation produces killers, and exposure produces performers. Performers need an audience. Killers need precision. When no one is watching, you stop performing effort. You stop exaggerating struggle. You stop dramatizing difficulty. You simply execute. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler should appear virtuous, but act decisively. The appearance is for the public. The action is done in private. The mistake most men make is trying to reverse this. They act publicly and think privately. They announce goals and quietly doubt themselves. They seek validation first and discipline later. The man with zero support has no such luxury. His work is invisible, so his results must be undeniable. This is where isolation becomes leverage, because when people don't know what you're doing, they can't sabotage it, they can't discourage it, they can't contaminate it with their fear. You move in silence, and silence protects momentum. There's another advantage few men talk about. When you succeed without support, your standards rise violently. You stop tolerating excuses from yourself or others because you know exactly how much effort it takes to move forward alone. So when someone complains about circumstances, you hear weakness. When someone asks for reassurance, you hear dependency. When someone waits for permission, you hear delay. And delay is the enemy of power. The man in our story became ruthless, not with people, but with time. He stopped entertaining distractions, stopped explaining boundaries, stopped negotiating with comfort, because no one was invested in his success. So wasting time felt like betrayal of self. This is the quiet transformation. Isolation doesn't make you bitter, it makes you efficient, and efficiency compounds. One disciplined action leads to another. One completed task builds evidence. Evidence builds certainty, and certainty builds authority. Not the loud kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. People often ask why powerful men seem calm, why they don't overreact, why they don't seek approval. It's because they've already proven everything to themselves. They've operated without backup. They've survived without applause. They've built systems that don't depend on mood. And systems beat motivation every time. Machiavelli believed the strongest position is one where others depend on you more than you depend on them. Isolation is how that imbalance begins. When you build alone, you don't owe favors. You don't share control. You don't dilute vision. You become the source. And when you become the source, dynamics reverse. People don't support you because they like you. They align with you because you move reality. But here's the danger. Isolation can also destroy you if you misunderstand it. If you isolate emotionally instead of strategically, you become cold. If you isolate out of fear instead of purpose, you stagnate. If you isolate to avoid accountability, you rot. That's why the next rule matters more than all the others, because isolation without direction becomes exile. In the next part, I'll show you the third rule of succeeding with zero support, the rule that keeps isolation from turning into self-destruction. And once you hear it, you'll understand why most men shouldn't be alone, but a few must be. Isolation becomes lethal only when it gains direction. That is the third rule. Direction turns solitude into power. Without it, isolation rots the mind. With it, isolation forges identity. Most men who end up alone didn't choose it. They drifted there after disappointment, after rejection, after something didn't work. That kind of isolation is reactive, and reactive isolation breeds bitterness. But the man who succeeds with zero support chooses isolation deliberately, not to escape people, but to outgrow limitation. Machiavelli understood that a man without direction becomes dangerous to himself before he becomes dangerous to others. So he emphasized structure, order, control. The man in our story learned this the hard way. At first, isolation felt liberating. No opinions, no interruptions, no emotional noise. But then something strange happened. Days began to blur. Effort became inconsistent. Discipline slipped quietly, not because he lacked willpower, but because isolation magnifies whatever system you bring into it. If you bring chaos, it multiplies chaos. If you bring discipline, it sharpens discipline. This is the fork in the road. Most men reach this point and mistake freedom for flexibility. They loosen standards, they sleep later, they work when they feel like it, and slowly, isolation turns into decay. Machiavelli warned against this trap. A man without external pressure must create internal law, otherwise he becomes weak without realizing it. So the man did something radical. He imposed rules on himself, harder rules than anyone else ever had. Wake-up times that didn't negotiate, work blocks that didn't care about mood, daily targets that had consequences if missed. Not punishment, correction. He became his own authority. And that changed everything. When there is no boss, discipline must become sacred. When there is no audience, standards must become brutal. This is why most men fail with zero support. They confuse solitude with comfort. But solitude is not comfort, it's exposure. Every weakness surfaces, every excuse echoes louder, every lie collapses faster, and if you don't install structure, isolation will expose you and then consume you. Machiavelli believed power begins with self-mastery, not morality, not virtue, control of time, control of emotion, control of impulse. The man in our story didn't feel more motivated, he felt more governed. And governance produces momentum, because when rules are clear, decisions disappear. You don't debate whether to work. You execute. You don't question whether to continue. You proceed. This is the secret advantage of zero support. There is no one to negotiate with, no emotional appeals, no compromises, no excuses disguised as conversations, just rules and outcomes compound. Day after day, effort stacked, not dramatically, not visibly, but relentlessly. And slowly, something shifted again. The isolation no longer felt empty. It felt intentional, like being inside a fortress instead of a cage, because the walls weren't there to keep him trapped. They were there to keep distraction out. Most men want freedom without responsibility, but Machiavelli knew that freedom without control collapses into weakness. The man accepted something few ever do. No support means no rescue. And that's the point. When rescue is impossible, preparation becomes obsession. He began planning deeper, thinking longer, anticipating consequences, not out of fear, but out of respect for reality. This is how leaders are forged. Not in crowds, not in encouragement, but in long periods where the only feedback comes from results. And results don't lie. They don't care how hard it was. They don't care how lonely it felt. They don't care who believed. They either exist or they don't. And this is where isolation becomes irreversible. Once you've governed yourself successfully, returning to dependency feels unbearable. You can't unsee the weakness in waiting. You can't unfeel the control in structure. You can't unknow what it's like to move without permission. But here's the danger most men don't expect. Once you become self-governing, people will try to reclaim influence. They'll reappear with opinions, with advice, with concern, not because they want to help, but because your independence disrupts their comfort. In the next part, I'm going to show you the fourth rule of succeeding with zero support. The rule that protects your momentum when people suddenly start paying attention, because attention is not support. And if you don't understand the difference, it will cost you everything you built alone. Attention is a trap. That is the fourth rule. Attention arrives after progress, but it does not arrive to help. Most men think attention is validation. They think it means they're finally being seen, finally being supported, finally being understood. That belief is fatal. Machiavelli warned that praise is often a weapon disguised as kindness. It softens resolve. It invites compromise. It exposes direction. The man in our story learned this when something unexpected happened. People started asking questions, not hostile ones, curious ones. What are you working on? You seem different lately. You're really focused these days. On the surface, it felt good. After months of silence, someone finally noticed. But beneath that warmth was danger, because attention is not neutral. Attention probes, it measures, it seeks entry points. And the moment you start explaining yourself again, isolation collapses. This is where most men lose everything they built alone. They mistake curiosity for alignment. They mistake praise for loyalty. They mistake attention for support. But attention does not carry weight. Support shows up early. Attention shows up late. Support sacrifices. Attention spectates. Machiavelli understood this distinction. He knew allies are tested in obscurity, not in success. The man did something counterintuitive. He answered vaguely. He didn't reveal timelines, didn't explain strategy, didn't share pressure points. Not because he was arrogant, but because clarity is expensive. When people know your direction, they feel entitled to influence it. They suggest changes, offer improvements, express concern, all of it framed as help. But every suggestion bends your vision slightly, and enough slight bends collapse structure. The man remembered how far he'd come without advice, without opinions, without emotional interference. He realized something sharp and uncomfortable. The same people who doubted him early now wanted proximity, not to assist, but to belong. Belonging is expensive. Because belonging creates obligation. Machiavelli warned leaders not to confuse popularity with power. Popularity demands compromise. Power demands clarity. The man protected his clarity ruthlessly. He kept his circle empty, his process invisible, his standards unchanged. And this made people uncomfortable. They felt shut out, excluded, confused. But discomfort is not injustice. It's the price of independence. Here's the brutal truth. When you succeed with zero support, people don't join to help you climb. They join to share the view, and if you let them influence the structure, they weaken it. This is why empire builders move quietly even after success. They don't announce milestones. They don't celebrate publicly. They don't invite commentary, because celebration invites interpretation. Interpretation invites distortion. Machiavelli wrote that revealing strength invites challenge, but revealing process invites sabotage. The man understood this instinctively. He stopped correcting misconceptions, stopped defending silence, stopped seeking approval again. And here's the paradox. The less he explained, the more serious he appeared. The less he shared, the more authority he radiated. Because authority isn't loud, it's stable. People began treating him differently, not because they understood him, but because they couldn't. And uncertainty commands respect. This is why powerful men feel distant, not because they are cold, but because distance preserves structure. The mistake most men make is opening the gates too early. They let attention in before foundations are complete. They let opinions shape unfinished systems. They let praise slow execution, and momentum dies. The man refused. He remembered what it cost to build alone, the nights without reassurance, the days without confirmation. He wasn't about to trade that strength for approval, because approval is temporary, but systems last. And that's when something shifted again. Attention turned into speculation. Speculation turned into curiosity. Curiosity turned into respect, not admiration. Respect, the kind that doesn't ask questions, the kind that waits. In the next part, I'm going to show you the fifth rule of succeeding with zero support. The rule that determines whether isolation turns you into a tyrant or a strategist. Because power without calibration becomes self-destruction, and Machiavelli knew exactly where that line was. Power changes you. That is the fifth rule. If you don't calibrate it, it will betray you. Most men think the danger is weakness, but Machiavelli knew the real danger comes after strength appears. It comes when independence hardens into arrogance, when solitude turns into superiority, when control mutates into contempt. The man in our story felt it creeping in, a subtle edge in his thoughts, a quiet impatience with others, a belief that no one else could keep up. And that belief was half true. But half-truths are the most dangerous kind, because they justify excess. Machiavelli warned that a ruler who becomes drunk on self-sufficiency loses perspective, and perspective is what keeps power functional. The man caught himself, not through guilt, through strategy. He asked a brutal question: is this isolation making me sharper or just colder? That question saved him, because power is not about distancing from people. It's about positioning above emotion. The mistake many men make after succeeding alone is rejecting collaboration entirely. They confuse independence with isolation forever. But Machiavelli never advocated permanent solitude. He advocated controlled alliances. There is a difference. Isolation is a phase. Leverage is the outcome. Once the man stabilized his system, once discipline was automatic, once results were consistent, he began selectively engaging, not emotionally, strategically. He didn't invite opinions. He invited utility. People weren't allowed access to his vision, only to execution roles. And this preserved authority, so he could afford cooperation. This is the final evolution. When you succeed with zero support, you don't stay alone forever. You become selective. Machiavelli wrote that the strongest leaders choose allies, not companions. Companions seek closeness. Allies serve function. The man learned to observe people carefully, who respected boundaries, who needed reassurance, who tried to influence direction. He didn't judge them morally. He categorized them strategically, and this prevented corruption. Because power corrupts fastest when it tries to be liked, the man stopped needing to be liked, so he could afford to be fair. That is the paradox few understand. Independence produces generosity when it's complete. Neediness produces manipulation. Machiavelli understood this deeply. A man who needs others cannot lead them. A man who doesn't need them can choose them. The isolation phase ended not with loneliness, but with clarity. The man knew exactly who belonged where, exactly what he would tolerate, exactly what he would never sacrifice again. And that certainty radiated. People felt safe around him, not because he was warm, but because he was consistent. Consistency is the highest form of trust, and trust compounds power faster than fear. But here's the final danger. The most dangerous moment is not when no one believes in you. It's when they finally do. Because belief invites dependence, and dependence invites decay. In the next part, I'm going to show you the 6th rule of succeeding with zero support. The rule that ensures your power never collapses under expectation. This is the rule that separates temporary dominance from lasting influence. There is a moment when the world flips. That is the 6th rule. The greatest threat to your power is becoming necessary to others. Most men dream of being needed, respected, relied upon. They think dependence equals importance. Machiavelli knew better. Dependence is a leash, and the moment others need you emotionally, strategically, or structurally, they begin to pull. The man in our story reached a dangerous milestone. People didn't just respect him anymore. They leaned on him. They asked for guidance, for reassurance, for decisions. What once felt like isolation had inverted into gravity. And gravity is heavy. At first, it felt like success. Finally, others recognized his strength. Finally, they trusted his judgment. Finally, he wasn't alone. But that comfort came with a cost. His time began to fracture. His focus diluted. His system, once airtight, started bending under external demands, and he felt something familiar creeping back. Expectation. Machiavelli warned that leaders fall not when they are opposed, but when they are overburdened. Because opposition sharpens, dependence drains. The man realized something critical. If he became the pillar, the structure would weaken. So he did something most men are too afraid to do. He refused dependence, not cruelly, not dramatically, quietly. He stopped rescuing, stopped solving emotional problems, stopped absorbing other people's uncertainty. He remained fair, consistent, unavailable. This confused people. Some felt abandoned, some felt disappointed, some felt entitled. But entitlement is not loyalty. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be respected than relied upon. Reliance creates obligation, respect creates distance, and distance preserves power. The man understood the final transformation. Succeeding with zero support was never about staying alone. It was about never returning to emotional dependence on either side. He didn't need belief. He didn't offer reassurance. He didn't promise safety. He offered structure, and structure is rare. People adjusted. Some left. Some adapted. Some respected the boundary, and the system stabilized again, stronger than before. This is the level most never reach, where you are neither isolated nor entangled, neither dependent nor depended on. You are autonomous. Machiavelli believed autonomy was the highest form of power, because an autonomous man cannot be manipulated through fear, approval, or obligation. He moves when he decides. He stops when he chooses. He engages only when it serves purpose. The man had built something invisible but unbreakable, a self-sustaining identity, not fueled by praise, not threatened by criticism, not slowed by silence. And there was one final realization. The loneliness he once feared had been the training ground. The silence had been instruction. The lack of support had been the filter. It removed weakness, burned dependency, exposed resolve, and now nothing external could touch the core. In the final part, I'm going to show you the last rule, the rule that determines whether everything you built lasts or collapses the moment pressure returns. This is the rule Machiavelli reserved for the end. There is one rule that decides whether everything you built survives. The final rule. The rule Machiavelli understood better than most men ever will. You must never forget what it felt like when no one cared, because the moment you forget that silence, you begin to weaken. Most men collapse not from failure, but from comfort. They remember the struggle emotionally, but not structurally. They remember the pain, but not the discipline it created. They remember the loneliness, but not the precision it forced. And that is how empires decay. Machiavelli warned that rulers fall when they grow sentimental about their rise, when they romanticize hardship instead of preserving its lessons. The man in our story understood this instinctively. He didn't celebrate the end of isolation. He preserved its principles even as success stabilized, even as influence expanded, even as respect became consistent. He kept operating as if silence could return at any moment, because it could. Support is conditional, attention is temporary, allies change. But the system you build alone, that remains. The man kept one ritual sacred. Every decision was filtered through a single question. Would I still do this if no one approved? If the answer was no, he didn't do it. That rule protected everything. It prevented laziness, it prevented ego, it prevented dependence from creeping back in. Because success tries to soften you. It whispers that you've earned comfort, that you deserve ease, that you can relax now. Machiavelli would call that whisper fatal. Power must be maintained with the same discipline it was built. The man never forgot the nights without reassurance, the days without confirmation, the weeks without feedback. He didn't dwell on them emotionally. He honored them structurally, by keeping standards high, by keeping explanations minimal, by keeping execution relentless. This is the final transformation. You stop identifying as someone who succeeded despite no support. You become someone who no longer requires it. That is the difference between achievement and authority. Achievement can be taken, authority cannot. Because authority is internal. It does not depend on praise. It does not react to criticism. It does not negotiate with fear. Machiavelli believed the strongest man is the one who cannot be threatened with loss, because he never relied on what could be taken. The man had reached that state. And here's the final truth most men never hear. If you are alone right now, confused, unsupported, unseen, you are not behind. You are being forged. The silence is not punishment. It is instruction. The lack of belief is not rejection. It is filtration. And the discomfort you feel is the sensation of becoming independent. Most men will escape it. They'll seek noise, validation, permission. But if you stay, if you build anyway, if you discipline yourself anyway, if you move forward anyway, you won't just succeed. You will become untouchable. And once that happens, you will never need support again. Disclaimer: this video was created with the assistance of artificial intelligence, AI. AI tools were used for script writing, voice generation, and slash or visual elements to enhance storytelling, clarity, and production quality. All ideas, themes, and editorial direction are original and curated for educational and motivational purposes. This content does not represent real persons, events, or financial advice. Viewer discretion and independent judgment are advised.